How to design a tie rod in Practicad. The best way to get your tie rods into Practicad is to import them from Practicam after they're developed there. However, you are also capable of developing them here in Practicad. To design a tie rod, we're going to go into the library icon on the Practicad ribbon. We're going to open up the library window. We're going to come to the left in our browser and we're going to scroll down to where we see accessories and open up the accessories choices. Now we're going to click on the word tie rod. When we do that, Practicad is going to show us a list of available tie rods that we have currently. We're also going to get the ability to import tie rods directly from Practicam. If we would like to design a new tie rod, we must come over to the left and click on the Create a New Item check. When we do that, Practicad is going to create a new tie rod for us and ask us to name it. We're going to name this one PCAD tie rod and hit Enter. Currently on the screen, we're going to have a variety of different choices. We have what we call the common parameters up top. We have what we call the joint parameters right over here in the bottom center. And over here in the bottom right, we have the center parameters. All of these parameters are coming directly from Practicam. To demonstrate this to you, we are inside Practicam currently. We're underneath My Libraries Accessories. We're over here under the tie rod section, and you can see it's divided into the 4 quadrants. Tie rods for the names, all of our common parameters, all of our joint parameters, and all of our center parameters. And inside Practicad, we're going to go over these parameters one at a time, starting with the common parameters. The first common parameter we have is the parameter for length add. This parameter is a value we put in to make it so that the tie rod is actually sticking out of the fitting a specific distance on both sides. In other words, if we put in length add 6 inches, the tie rod should be sticking out of the fitting 6 inches on either end. We're going to represent this by going over to Practicam. Inside Practicam, you can see here we have the common parameters, and here's the length add parameter. If we were to put in the value 12 right here and hit enter, you can see that Practicam is sticking the tie rod out 12 inches from either side of the fitting. So length add will control that option. If you set it to 0, it's flush against the fitting. If you set it to any other number, whatever that number is, that is how far the tie rod on each end is sticking out of the fitting. The next 2 parameters, hole diameter and rod diameter, are simply talking about the size of the rod you're going to see on your preview and the size of the hole that we would drill if we were to download it to Practicam. Notice here that we've got hole diameter highlighted, and as we're moving up in value, you'll see that it's not going to affect your preview at all. The reason why is this is simply a Practicam parameter used for fabrication. So though this is reportable in Practicad, it will have no bearing on your drawing at all. However, the rod diameter size will. Whatever size you make the rod diameter is going to be the size of the rod in your preview on your drawing. Therefore, you would like to make sure that you size the rod diameter to whatever it is that you would like to see on your plot. Here we're just going to make it 1 inch. The interference parameter allows us to make sure that we do not have 2 rods colliding when we put rods on the width and the depth of a fitting. Whatever value we put here will be the spacing between rods if in fact they were placed on the same position on both width and depth. For example, here we're going to put interference as 2 inches. Then we're going to exit out of our drawing and look at a fitting. Currently on our drawing, we have the PCAD tie rod in the center of the fitting on both the width, as you can see here, and the depth, as you can see here by looking at it in top view. You can see that Practicad has put a 2-inch gap between the two because this was the value we selected for interference. So interference will allow us to make sure we do not have tie rods colliding into one another when we put them on both the width and the depth. Cut holes is a parameter that really only affects Practicam. If you choose cut holes yes, it's going to download the Practicad rods into Practicam, and Practicam will cut the holes there. If you'd like to report whether or not the holes are being cut, you can choose the proper choice here, yes or no. However, this will have no effect on your drawing space, preview, or anything else other than your reports inside Practicad. We simply wanted to make sure that we matched up all the Practicam properties with all the Practicad properties. The last common parameter we have is the weight parameter. Practicat is capable of calculating the weight of the entire duct line, and if you would like your tie rod accessories to be accounted for in that weight, you must put in a weight in pounds in this particular field. So if you knew that each tie rod was going to weigh a quarter of a pound, we would simply put in 0.25. When we go to do a weight report later, Practicat can add these tie rods to the total weight. In the second part of the parameter section, we're going to cover the joint parameters. There are two quadrants for joint parameters. The first one controls the joint parameters for the in joint. The second one right here controls the joint parameters for the out joint. Once you've learned one, you've already learned the other. They are identical. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the joint parameters here. And we're going to focus first on the three methods of placement, because the method of placement is really what's going to dictate how each of these parameters work. The method of placement is divided into three sections. We have quantity, space, and space exact. We're first going to start with quantity, which is the easiest one. Whenever you choose the method of placement quantity, it means whatever value you put here, let's say it's 1, 2, 3, that is the exact number of tie rods we're going to have on the in joint, regardless of how big the width of the joint may get. And if we choose quantity 1, it's going to ask us here to offset that tie rod from the in joint a specific amount. So what we're going to do here is say offset 2 inches, enter. When we hit 2 inches, you can see that Practicat's placed the tie rod 2 inches from the in joint, quantity 1. You will notice here that you do have a parameter for side offset on in as well. Here we're going to change it to 2. Now it's not affecting the center one at all. Where side offset will start to affect is if you raise the quantity to 2 or more. Notice here when we put on 2, now we've got a tie rod on either end. And the distance that tie rod is from the in joint is by offset from in. The distance the tie rod is from the side of the wall is from the parameter side offset on in. So if we make this 6 inches, we now have only 2 tie rods in quantity that are 2 inches from the in joint. Each are 6 inches from the side. You'll notice here that if we were to put one more tie rod in there, it's going to put one that splits the difference between the two. So the way it would place things from one end of the duct to the other is it place one on one end based on whatever your side offset is, another on the other end, which would have the same exact side offset as this one, and then no matter what number you pick from then on, it's just going to split the difference based on the number. So if I said quantity 4, we're going to get 4 tie rods. Regardless of how big this width may get, we're only going to get 4 tie rods. The second method we're going to cover is the method of placement called space. Basically what the space method does is it takes the entire length of the joint and it divides it up equally so that the distance between each tie rod will be exactly the same. Now that distance might vary. However, what we do when we select a method for space, Practicat opens up the option for spacing on in, and then we give it a value. Now the value we give here is not necessarily going to be the value between or the distance between tie rods. The value here means that we're telling Practicat if we say 6 inches for spacing on in, and we're in the space method of placement, we're stating that there better not be a gap between tie rods any larger than 6 inches. For every 6 inches, we must have a tie rod. However, the distance between those tie rods might vary a little bit depending on the odd value of the width of the duct. So just because we say space 6 inches, we might not necessarily get 6 inches exactly between the tie rods. For example, what we've got here on the screen is we've got the method of placement space on the right. And what we've done is we had set the value for 6 and we ran these tie rods down the line. Now you'll see what Practicat did was it actually took the entire length and it chopped it up so that we have equal distance between each tie rod. Even though the value we said was 6, Practicad uses that as the maximum distance allowed between the two tie rods. Here you can see from the edge we have 5.5 inches to the tie rod. And then in between each tie rod, you can see it's marked by the dimensions lines, we have 5.5 inches. So what it did was it took the total length allowed between the two tie rods, it divided it up by the maximum spacing, and it makes sure that they're equal in value. This is different from the next method we're going to cover, which is called space exact. What space exact means is that the spacing value we put here has to be the distance between the tie rods. Whatever value you put here, in this particular case we put 6, that will be the distance between tie rods in the center joint. For example, here you can see what happened was it made sure that between all the tie rods, after the ones on the end, in between the first and the last placed, when you're going across the duct, we have exactly 6 inches of space in between. This one was used with the space exact method. Now that would mean that the walls, or the distance between the walls and the tie rod, that space might be shorter. But after the first tie rod, every single tie rod here is going to have exactly 6 inches of space between them. And of course, the last one's going to have whatever the spacing was the first did. So essentially what Practicad does is it creates the first one, then it puts as many in between, centered into the fitting at 6 inches apart, and it adjusts the ends. With the space method, Practicad simply takes the total length from end to end, it chops it up into equal amounts with the value it cannot be higher than. So you won't get any spacing between the tie rods greater than 6, but you can see here we have it less than 6. Here what Practicad did was it decided to make exactly 5.5 inches in between each tie rod, rather than making an exact 6 inches in between the tie rods in the center and adjusting the ones on the end. So that is the difference between the space method and space exact. It is the same inside Practicam. Now we're going to cover the center parameters. Once you've watched the videos on joint in parameters and joint out parameters, the center parameters are virtually the same. There's only one difference. Center parameters have the option to control the spacing between rows. We only get one row for joint in parameters, one row of tie rods. We also get only one row of tie rods from the joint out. However, in between those two joints, we can have an unlimited number of rows of tie rods depending on how long the fitting gets. So in this particular case, we would first choose whatever center parameters we want, and then we need to choose how we dictate the spacing between the multiple rows. To start this off, we're simply going to look at the 3 methods of placement. We have quantity, space, and space exact, exactly what we had for joint parameters. We're going to choose the method space. We're going to say that the minimal spacing is going to be 6 inches and the side offset is going to be 2. Now that's going to control the spacing from one end of the fitting to the other in terms of the width of the fitting. However, we now need to go to the line placement options to control the number of rows between the joints and the spacing between those rows. Currently, there are 4 options for line placement: quantity, space, adjustable, and space exact. 3 of these we've covered earlier in the videos. However, we have not covered the adjustable line placement. What line placement is designed to do is to allow us to specify the method we're going to use to dictate the number of rows of tie rods we're going to get in between the connector in and connector out of a specific fitting. For example, right now we're under the line placement quantity and we have line quantity 1. That means that in the center we're only going to get 1 row. If we said 2, we'd get 2 rows, regardless of how big the fitting would get. If we chose the line placement method space, it would follow the spacing method. Here we would give the minimal line spacing, we'd give it a value. Here it's set at a foot, and Practicad would put as many rows as it took to make sure that the distance between rows in the center or not greater than 12 inches. To demonstrate the adjustable line placement parameter, what we're going to do is create a different tie rod. And over here on the left, we've created one called adjustable. We're going to go over there and we're going to take a look at the difference. The only difference between the PCAD tie rod we have here and the adjustable tie rod we created is the line placement here has been chosen to be adjustable and the line spacing is 12 inches. Now what we're going to do is put two fittings on the drawing and edit them with both tie rod methods of placement. On the drawing we have two fittings. The first fitting on the left has tie rods in it used with the PCAD tie rod we created. The one on the right has tie rods inside of it used with the adjustable tie rod we created. The adjustable one has the adjustable spacing for line placement. The PCAD tie rod on the left has the space method for line placement. To show you the difference between these two fittings, we're going to edit them and it'll become apparent how these methods for spacing are different. First, we're going to click on the fitting on the left that was done with the space line placement. Notice that as this fitting gets longer or it's edited so it's larger, that the distance between the tie rods stay the same. And most importantly, that the distance between the connector in and the first tie rod and the connector out and the last tie rod happen to be equal. Even if I were to shrink the length of this fitting right up against the last row of tie rods, Practicad readjusts them so that we have even spacing. The adjustable line placement does not work that way. The way the adjustable line placement works is whatever spacing parameter you give it, whatever value, in this tutorial it was 12, it means that the first center row starts 12 inches from either the connector in or the first row of tie rods. And then it continues at 12 inches between rows up until there's no more room to put another row. That would mean that the distance between the last row of tie rods and the connector out is less than your minimal spacing. However, if we were to adjust this to be larger, you can see that it's going to add another row. If we are to adjust it to be shorter though, you're going to see that it does not reapply the tie rods and adjust it as it did here with the space. Space means that from end to end, we take the total length, chop it up in equal segments, and then calculate the spacing upon each edit. When you do it the adjustable space or line placement method, it simply starts from the connector in and goes row at 12 inches, row at 24 inches, row at 36, row at 48, row at 60, and it goes on until there's no room for another row. That could mean that you're going to have tie rods that are closer to the out connection than are the in connection. And that is the difference between these two methods. That is also going to conclude the entire tutorial on how to create a tie rod.